Chumlum says, okay. Chumlum says, I don't like 8-1 because the first 3 photos suck. Chumlum says, you have to wait for Ran to get stuck on the top right, and that can take a long time, or never happen in all the 2 minutes. Chumlum says, and you want time left over for the next 3 photos too, of course. Chumlum says, scary end. But that's how this game is. Namashon Richmond says, having bullets all over your face is pretty scary. Chumlum says, 8-3, wait for Ran to be exactly in the middle for large bonuses. Chumlum says, it is a matter of pixels. Chumlum says, I like the first STRAT on August 4th. Badass. Chumlum says, the next 4 photos are too random. Kirby comment says, going above the Yucko is badass indeed. Chumlum says, not bad, that is easy, easiest score STRAT does that exclusively. Namashon Richmond says, I want to be above the Yucko. Chumlum says, guiding all the butterflies and lasers is strict. Chumlum says, and gets a higher score. Chumlum says, Air Guy only lost around 6,000 on August 5th in execution mistake. The remainder of score available is luck. Chumlum says, luck asterisk. Kawagurl 98 says, did it say August 5th? Vicodin says, yes. Chumlum says, 8 to 5. Chumlum says, looks like it was your imagination. Not really. Captain RESKO69 says, on April 3rd. Chumlum says, 8 to 6 is harder than it looks. Kirby comment says, 8 to 5. Vicodin says, what? Chumlum says, you have to do exact timing, and survive until the last second, and survive while dodging without charging, because charging won't guide the lens to you Yucko. Kawagurl 98 says, watching this is making me realize that this is probably the best game Zun has made in regards to making the attacks look good. Kawagurl 98 says, I think he might have been better with spells before. Chumlum says, I would say so, on their own. Kawagurl 98 says, whereas he improved with stage portions a lot later on. Kirby comment says, I can kind of agree with that. Chumlum says, although PCB is pretty close. Kawagurl 98 says, yeah. Some stuff in PCB comes to mind. Chumlum says, I like FW but the patterns don't always look that great just on their own. It's the freezing that makes it feel good. Chumlum says, patterns are very messy. Kirby comment says, freezing patterns look great. Chumlum says, sadness in this run because the last photo was badly executed. Chumlum says, 1.5 boss shot. Chumlum says, this is the score I got today that got me to 67 mil. Chumlum says, I played this a lot lately and slowly learned how to influence the biggest patterns. Namashandrachman says. Chumlum says, the main problem is that you will often die after the photo is taken. Chumlum says, probably around 50% of the time, so 1 out of 8 runs you will die on. Kirby comment says, Kirby comment says, 800k on one photo. Chumlum says, my best is 852. Chumlum says, it is lucky. in disbelief that I can even pull a run like this. Chunlum says, "It sure took long." Kirby comment says, "I can see this non taking a long time to optimize." Chumlum says, "Nobody has optimized it." Chumlum says, "Even." Chumlum says, "It isn't human to do." Kirby comment says, "Well, you know, as close to optimized as possible P." Chumlum says, "Yeah. K.K did a great job at that." Chumlum says, 200 average per photo. Chumlum says, 93 has weird timing. Chumlum says, "Also Ira needs to move correctly or it's GG." Chumlum says, "I like 9 to 5. It is very creative and very difficult at the same time in a score run." Chumlum says, "I use my own route but WR route is better." Chumlum says, 9 to 6, you get around 30k bonuses for timing. News Rump 1 says, I returned just in time for 9 to 6 flow. Awadural 98 says, is this still your favorite spell? Chumlum says, yes. Chumlum says, favorite thing in Tuhao besides maybe ID. Chumlum says, here I got 6 out of 7 explosions in this run. Chumlum says, see, that photo was very close up, with a boss shot 1.9. But no explosion. Chumlum says, so very close run to even more score. Chumlum says, 9 to 7, being as close to the bubbles as possible is more optimal, so I don't like the lasers due to that. Chumlum says, it is easier if you let your hitbox marker go a little inside the laser. Chumlum says, but then you will lose score or compromise later. Chumlum says, 9 to 8 has the usual lens and self-shot death. Chumlum says, lens won't be positioned well unless you move forward and then back. Chumlum says, self-shots are lost often here. Chumlum says, I don't think you can play this game with a controller. Chumlum says, this is frame perfection of what can super lucky last 2 photos. Chumlum says, long grind. Namishon Richmond says, insanity. Chumlum says, my best score in this game by far. Kirby comment says, scary. Chumlum says, 10 to 2 isn't as hard as it looks but... Chumlum says, luck with the photo value is huge. Chumlum says, my final photo was really unlucky which made me sad. The others were lucky. Chumlum says, That's why I used many defensive shots. Don't want to risk a lucky run, rather just stall until an easy wave comes. Terrible photo for his set. Otherwise I like this run. says, never understood why the last shots in this got so hot. Chumlum says, very many fast bullets and big explosions, and I guess this bullet type is simply valuable. Kawigural 98 says, Chumlum says, but I need to look at it more closely to understand why phase 1 is worth so much less, so I agree with you a bit. Kirby comment says, even though they're the exact same bullet. Chumlum says, it looks like it may be multiple bullets stacked. Chumlum says, but that's just a guess. Kirby comment says, yeah. Chumlum says, EX1 harder than it looks. Chumlum says, very strict. Chumlum says, EX2 super strict. Chumlum says, but virtually no RNG I think. Chumlum says, 187. Chumlum says, this dash up to Yukari is pixel precise, it's probably only right to accept the pixels LOL. Chumlum says, I use the background to position. Kirby comment says, that's demanding. Namishon Bridgman says, looking at Lookery's Boots ADD Dress 3. Namishon Bridgman says, and asterisk. Chumlum says, there's a certain piece of the dress that I use. Chumlum says, Photo 4 was wrong in this run, but most things else were clean I think. Chumlum says, 20.000 dropped from Photo 4 or something like that because not centered Yukari. Arfitaho says, neat. Muse Rump 1 says, lel. Kyrua says, how are you not getting hit? Kyrua says, WTF is this? Chumlum says, I normally get hit 10 times per minute on that card. Muse Rump 1 says, now do it with hitbox on. FTW Indicium says, Super Players. Kirby comment says, if you move sideways in the same pattern, you won't get hit. Kirby comment says, that spell is aim. Kyrua says, I have a feeling this one is gonna be long. Namashanbridgman says, stack the bullet. Chumlum says, this is long yes. Arpita Ho says, bullet farming with chum. Chumlum says, for good photos 2 to 3 you need to keep going. Chumlum says, also to survive. Chumlum says, can't have photos around the sides. Chumlum says, bullets around the sides asterisk. Kirby comment says, wait, does getting past 1 mil mess up the way how the score displays? Chumlum says, yes. Chumlum says, it turned into letters on October 8th. Kirby comment says, oh. OKP. Chumlum says, oh, my PB wasn't that long. I have other runs on EX7 that were timeouts or otherwise long. Kyrua says, October 8th. Chumlum says, this scene is so extremely unfair and the end user almost always die, so I used the compromise photo as the final photo. Chumlum says, want to try to finish with 2 million without compromise photo at the end though. Chumlum says, there we go, thanks for watching. Kyrua says, GG. MORTH1 says, G. MuseRump1 says, cool stuffs, T4S. MORTH1 says, GG asterisk.